If you've been told to pull up your socks, then make sure it's a pair of TNT socks. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. From national security to global corruption, you're with Scott Wheeler and Through the Looking Glass on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. And before we get to our expert witness today, let me inform the audience of some breaking news. This is from the Washington Times just a few moments ago. President Biden's stash of classified documents reportedly included material marked top secret, the nation's highest classification level. The highly classified material was recovered among approximately 10 classified documents at Mr. Biden's think tank in the fall, a federal official familiar with the investigation told CBS. Top secret material could pose exceptionally grave damage to national security if leaked. Now, if this seems like some kind of cosmic karma catching up to Joe Biden after making such a huge deal of the dispute former President Trump had with the National Archives over documents he collected and kept and was negotiating to keep and claims that he declassified. It has to be one of the most bizarre things that we've seen. It's been kept under wraps. It was only once it was leaked that it came out. And I might also point out that where the top secret documents were kept at his think tank, the Penn Biden think tank at University of Pennsylvania University, was funded by the People's Republic of China, to the tune of $15 million specifically for the Penn Biden think tank, and another $15 million for University of Penn itself. And so $30 million, perhaps more. We're not to the end of that. And also this week, something that's been rather arcane and referenced was an email from Hunter Biden's laptop referencing the Penn Biden think tank. And that was saying it'll be like the Clinton Global Initiative without the fundraising. And people have interpreted that in the news media, I should say. My colleagues have interpreted that to mean that Hunter Biden was saying we're not going to raise money the way the Clinton Global Initiative did. And they see it as rather innocuous. I would say it implies that they already knew they were going to be funded by China and therefore didn't need to engage in fundraising. Also, Biden was paid nearly $1 million for his involvement in the Penn Biden think tank. We don't know who else was paid by the Penn Biden think tank, who might have been, receiving payments for other favors. That's going to be more to come. We have a lot to investigate there. Right now, we're going to shift gears and talk about the fate of the United States, because as many of you know, we're in a very trying time. In fact, in October, the New York Times entertained the idea that we might be heading for another civil war. This is from the New York Times, October 12. America's divided and battling many different internal wars over politics, culture, language, religion. Is it possible all the internal divisions could culminate in a civil war? The Times asks. Today's episode of The Argument brings together Jamelle Bouie and Tim Alberta to assess. Bouie is the Times opinion columnist and historian of America's Civil War. Alberta is a staff writer for The Atlantic and made the case that the FBI Mar-a-Lago search was the tipping point for political violence that could put our democracy at stake. Now, of course, the Times' position on this, as is Alberta and Bouie's, is that it's the right wing that is a threat to the country. And as we have demonstrated in episodes of Through the Looking Glass on TNT Radio in the past, the real threat comes from the left and its violent organizations, whether it's the global anarchist movement, which nobody seems to notice actually does the bidding of the Democrat Party, or whether it's Antifa or many other Black Lives Matter, many other domestic, well-funded and violent extremist groups. But the Times, of course, believes that it is the right. The real threat comes from the right, simply for if I could put this in a nutshell for the listening audience, think of it like this. The left believes that people who want to be left alone by the government are the real threat, while the people who want to control, monitor, and spy on its citizens and control every aspect of their lives are the benevolent forces here. It's very strange. In fact, Tim Alberta, writing in The Atlantic about this, has told the New York Times, I think we probably start with what civil war is and is not in this context. We're not talking about armies of red and blue fighting another battle of Antietam. We're not talking about the forces of Charlie Kirk clashing in the streets with the forces of Keith Olbermann or pick your figurehead. We're not talking about something anywhere near, I think, the scale or anywhere near resembling the organization of what we saw in the mid-19th century. Now, they go on to talk about, in the Times, they go on to discuss what a civil war might look like. But I have in the past explained that I believe the way it would begin would be a strong governor of a state, probably in the South, draws lines around itself, and people begin to migrate. People who agree with that particular strong governor migrate to that state, and they have a very powerful voice. And at some point, the federal mandates for that state become so great that the governor says, we're not going to do that. We're not going to participate. And then that becomes a touch point for a civil war or for a secession movement among the people in that state. That's how something like this could happen. Now, of course, because the New York Times and those on the left, many college professors have written about this in the past couple of years. Their position is that it's the right committing the violence. And we have not seen this. We've seen very little evidence of right-wing violence. Most of the violence is coming from the left, and the right just wants to be left alone, and there's no interest in starting a civil war. There is an interest, however, in being around people of like mind, and that could lead to the division. Now, that brings us to our expert witness today. His name is Michael Wilkerson. He is the author of Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. And Mr. Wilkerson has a very positive outlook, it would seem, and he has some ideas that would that promote the idea of unity. And so we're going to ask him about that. First, let me tell you a little about him. He is not just the author of Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism. He's an investor, a strategic advisor, and the founder of the Stormwall.com. He's author of The Storm Wall, Observations on America in Peril, and a frequent contributor to prominent media outlets such as Fox Business and on topics of economics, finance, governance, and foreign affairs. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, an MA in International Relations from Yale University, and a BS BS summa cum laude, by the way, from Oral Roberts University. So a very interesting pedigree. You go from Oral Roberts to Yale and the Kennedy School. Mr. Wilkerson, welcome to Through the Looking Glass. Can you tell me a little about how you went from Oral Roberts to right into the Ivy League arena, and what attracted you to that?
Well, hi, Scott. First of all, great to be with you. Happy New Year. Sure, happy to dive right in there. When I was a senior at ORU, I felt that my education wasn't done. I went straight after college to graduate school. I was very interested in the world of foreign affairs, international relations. At this point, this was the early 90s. It was the supposedly end of history, a popular phrase at the time. The idea that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism, at least as it was manifested in the Soviet Union, that we were at a tipping point. And in fact, one of the reasons I decided not to pursue a career in those fields was everybody said, don't go, it's over. It's going to be a very uninteresting time. Go off into business and finance. And I did. I went on to work in Wall Street and merger and acquisitions expert for a long time. But I never lost my interest in geopolitics, in geostrategy, and the things that were going on around the world. And of course, it only took a few more years until we realized that we had not reached the end of history, that the world was still turning in unpredictable ways. And in fact, that the same issue that we've been facing, which is the confrontation between the West and totalitarianism and communism, still exists today.
Now, so your interests were really what has driven you away from your educational vocation and into the issues you're dealing with now, which are, well, I would say, in fact, I wrote a book in 2012, Promoting Decline, Obama versus America, where I make the case that America is in decline, but you're not convinced. Is that right? Your book kind of suggests that there's a way out.
Both can be true at the same time. I think we're in a very difficult period. We are in a crisis period. America is struggling. In my book, I describe it not as the death of America, but that we're in a winter season. And what are winters like? They're cold, they're dark, they're hostile, they're unfriendly, and nothing seems to live. It's all dead. But you have to go through winter in order to get to spring. If you look at American history, it really is the same. Think about over the long arc of American history, the big cycles that led to crises, cataclysms, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the upheaval of the 60s. All of these brought about major shifts, and somehow America survived through all of them. I argue that, yes, we face a very serious crisis today that is akin to those, not exactly the same, and thank God not as serious as the Civil War or the Great Depression yet. But nonetheless, you are also, so I think that we are in a bad place. But I also argue, as you pointed out, that it's not hopeless, that there is a way out, that just as America in the past has found a way forward, the resilience of both the American people, but most importantly, the ideals of America are so strong that they've enabled this country to continue on and survive when we return to them, when we return to the founding ideals that forced the issue of slavery through the Civil War, for example.
Well, some of the smartest people I know, we talk about these issues regularly, and some of the smartest people I know say precisely what you have just stated, that it's not over, and we saw many of them refer to the 60s, the late 60s, and see similarities. Where I would differ or take issue is that we now, at the time in the 60s, for example, the political leadership, the Democrat Party was made up of mostly liberals in those days, but they were liberals who believed in the American ideal. We don't really have that anymore. And I've said this, it's a very cynical observation, but I pointed out that the Democrat Party seems to be the most corrupt institution in the history of Western civilization. Now, that's not a pro-Republican statement, because I coined the phrase that's now often used, that the two parties in this country consist of the corrupt party and the stupid party. Republicans are the stupid party. But the Democrat Party is so corrupt and thoroughly corrupt that it may have found a way, not necessarily intentionally found a way, but its corruption has led it to corrode all the other important institutions in the country to the point where they cannot be fixed. And you see this differently, I think. You do reference in your book, corrupt institutions. What institutions do you
so let me just, one of the things I say and why America matters is that the conflict is no longer now strictly left versus right. I make the point that old school liberals, okay, who cared about things like being freedom from government, being free of surveillance, autonomy, independence, have more in common with populist conservatives today than either do with those who believe in big government, who are perfectly fine with government control and surveillance. We've really shifted the axes here on what matters. I talk about in Why America Matters 4 crises in our nation. And one of them was the crisis of circumstances. Another is a crisis of identity. You bring up the crisis of institutions, what I describe as a crisis of institutions, which is that our federal institutions are absolutely failing us across the board. They no longer trust the American people, and the American people no longer trust them. And that is a terrible place to start. When half of the nation is labeled domestic terrorists, you've reached the end of the road for reconciliation. When only 15% of...
Let me stop you right there, Mr. Wilkerson. We got to take a short time out. When we come back,
Okay.
We want to get into the institutions and the more detail on this. It's a fascinating subject, and the book is outstanding. I have not read it cover to cover yet, but what I have read is very thought-provoking. We'll take a short time out. We'll come back with more on Through the Looking Glass on TNT Radio.
TNT Radio's Jason Olbourne.
Now, as 2023 begins, the 2024, can you believe it? It's next year. Presidential election looms ahead. So far, former President Donald Trump has been the only Republican to announce their candidacy for 2024. And the favoured Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is widely expected to run. Now other Republicans are making their intentions known. Last month, Donald Trump's ex-national security advisor, John I Am the Walrus Bolton, teased a White House bid and lashed out at Trump over his attack on the Constitution. His attack on the Constitution. He said he would have to join the 2024 presidential race if other Republicans did not step up and condemn the former president, trying to get rid of the Constitution to ensure no election fraud reoccurs, despite no evidence the 2020 vote was stolen. Told NBC's Kristen Welker on Meet the Press Now, I think to be a presidential candidate, you cannot simply say, I support the Constitution. You have to say, I would oppose people who would undercut it.
Jason Olbourne and Jason Q. Citizen on TNT Radio.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Big pharma corruption, medical corruption, government corruption, political corruption, climate change corruption. The threats to your happiness are many, but that's where we can help. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio. Our truth shall keep you free.
Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler in Washington, D.C. And that last station promo seemed to fit well right into the subject we are on today. Well, actually, it fits into almost every broadcast we do here. We're on TNT Radio. Right now, we're speaking to our expert witness today. His name is Michael Wilkerson, and he has written the book, Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. And its subject matter is both deep and profound, and definitely worth reading for everyone who is attuned to the sort of crisis that America is in. And going into the break, I had to interrupt Mr. Wilkerson because my question was a long one, and it was poorly timed, consistent with our station break. So let me bring us back. You were talking about the president, basically, President Biden, has declared that half the country are domestic terrorists, and his party has been doing this for a little while now, for about 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And in your book, you talk about the four crises that the nation is facing.
Yeah.
Can you pick it up there? We're right where you
Yeah,
are.
I think of the four crises, we were talking about the crisis of institutions, which is the simple idea that the bureaucracy is failing. And I mentioned that the federal government no longer trusts Americans, and Americans therefore no longer trust the government. It's about trust, but it's also about competence. It is literally failing across the board. An example, only 15 or so % of Americans believe that approve of the way Congress is doing their job. They believe that it's failing, that it's the most corrupt institution of them all. But they're in a race with other organizations like the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, other three-letter agencies. I talk about there are three things that made America really exceptional, one of which this idea of God-given unalienable rights that could not be taken away by any government, by any sovereign. The separation of powers that kept people in their kept power checked and entities in their lanes, whether it was executive, judicial, or legislative. And then finally, third, the rule of law, this idea that no one is above the law, no king, no sovereign, no bureaucracy is outside of the scope. The three-letter agencies, what people call the swamp, it's a fair term, have violated all three of those core principles. And until that is stopped, until that itself is checked, it's going to be very difficult for America to be renewed, to be restored to what it really should be, a government of we the people, not we the bureaucracy, not we the globalists.
In your estimation, what has been the role of the news media in all of this?
They have become the puppets at the end of a very long string. One of the things I talk about in Why America Matters is this very corrupt collusion that has gone on between mainstream media, traditional or big tech social media, and the same elements of government. We're seeing it now. We knew it was happening. We could feel it. We could smell it. Many of us have been, blocked, canceled, shadow banned, whatever it was. But we knew that something bad had happened. I think what's going on now with the Twitter files obviously adds an exclamation point to it and evidence. But it is absolutely undermining this democracy. The ideas enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of worship, and the freedom to be free from surveillance have all been violated through this process of government collusion with big tech, big media.
What's even more curious to me is, and I say this as having an intelligence background, also being an investigative journalist for decades, but with an intelligence background and a military background, knew throughout the Cold War and through the 90s, even right up until about 2010, 2011, the media was hostile to the U.S. intelligence community, hostile to the military, hostile to the FBI. They didn't trust it, and they were suspicious. They believed in exposure. They believed in keeping them in check. And then suddenly something happened. It was like once the Democrat Party got a pretty wide footprint into the intelligence community, suddenly the media finds them worthy of defense no matter what they do. Have you noticed this?
Well, absolutely. And I made a comment before the break about how the alignment is now no longer traditional left and traditional right, because those kind of old school liberal journalists, they were after the truth. They didn't trust government. They wanted to be free from the things that were going on, surveillance, everything else. That they now have more in common with populist conservatives against those who are perfectly fine with government surveillance, who don't want to be suspicious or have those questions. I've absolutely noticed it. The media have been co-opted. It occurred over a period of time when traditional media was struggling as a business model with the rise of the democratization of the internet and media and that sort of thing. So it was coincidental. I don't know that one caused the other. But today, one simply cannot trust the traditional sources of media. And that's why independent journalists are a rare breed, but those who are standing up and writing and speaking are needed more than ever.
Needed more than ever, indeed. And there seems to be a small group, and it is that coalition that you referenced of liberals and populists that are concerned about similar things, who also notice that they're being nudged out by party hacks who run about 85%, control about 85% of the media in the United States. And I believe this began and I reported this before, but about 1992, when during the 92 election, Bill Clinton ran on probably his second, perhaps third most important issue was human rights in China. He referred to, in the 92 election, referred to the butchers of Beijing and accused then H.W. Bush of coddling, his word, coddling the butchers of Beijing. And the media made human rights in China a big issue in that campaign. Once Bill Clinton became president, he not only subordinated human rights in China to a very low priority, he accelerated the transfer of technology from the United States to communist China, enabling them to further oppress their citizens. And by 1997, when Madeleine Albright was appointed and passed the Senate to be the Secretary of State, in her confirmation speech, she said, relations with China will not be held hostage to any one issue, including human rights and the future of Hong Kong. When she made that statement, I was actually sitting in Hong Kong across the table from a Hong Kong council member named Emily Lau. And she handed me that and said, "This is what your country thinks about human rights in China." It was that moment at which the 92 election was the beginning of the end of liberals in media. They immediately circled the wagons around Bill Clinton while he was transferring technology to communist China, while he was coddling the very dictators, the butchers of Beijing that he accused H.W. Bush of coddling. And the media said very little about it at that moment. And I was a journalist at the time, and I kept looking around wondering, and I was considered a right-winger in the press corps because I was going after Bill Clinton about China. And I said, when did human rights become a right-wing issue for you guys? I've never gotten
so interesting
on this.
No, it's so interesting you raised this, Scott, because it sounds like you saw what was coming before many of us did, myself included. I didn't appreciate the significance of what was happening at the time. I think that history will show that one of the most important legacies of President Trump was that he pulled the smiley-faced facade of a Potemkin village of a relationship between the U.S. and China, just pulled off the mask, and revealed what was going on below, which is all of those years of technology transfer, all of the years of trade secrets being stolen, legally or illegally. That whole era, I think many of us were blind to. You and others may have been talking about it at the time, but we needed that shock of realizing what was going to happen, which of course culminated in the Wuhan flu, in the suppression of information that was going on there. It took something that extreme for Americans to really wake up, not just Americans in journalism or otherwise, but even in corporate boardrooms to say, hold on, this is actually a problem that we have to now do something about. It may be too little too late because so much was lost during those years. But I think it was an important transition to realize that he who sups with the devil needs a very long spoon. And we were way too intimate with China as a rising a potential adversary.
Well, there were many in the intelligence community who noticed this. In fact, I produced about 6 documentaries that covered all the aspects of the tech transfers, the millions of dollars in illegal campaign donations to then President Clinton, and the high-tech weapons systems that were decontrolled for communist China alone. I produced about 6 documentaries. The people who ordered the most were at the Defense Intelligence Agency. They've known about this for a very long time. And there were some trials, as many remember. There were some people who were put on trial. You had Charlie Tree, who was a Clinton appointee at the Department of Commerce, who many at the time believed to be a spy for China. He got the lightest sentence. The person who got the worst sentence of all did the least. His name was Johnny Chung, and he actually was the state's biggest cooperating witness against the others. The more corrupt the Janet Reno Justice Department let them off, the more corrupt they were, the more they worked to try and help the Justice Department find out what was lost and what had happened, got the worst punishment. It was justice in a way that it was shocking, and it was bracing at that time. Just as you said, Trump pulled the mask off this relationship, but it actually had been pulled off before. No one would pay attention to it, least of which the Republican Party, which could have gained from it. We saw Russia collusion become a political weapon for the Democrats, even though they created that narrative. Republicans had a real narrative, something real, evidence of criminal treason, perhaps, and they refused to do anything with it. And that's why I began calling them the stupid party, because they weren't even acting in their own interests. They weren't acting in a corrupt way. They were acting in a stupid way. They wouldn't even use the evidence that could have helped them get more power to get more power. And instead, they let the Democrats beat them to it. Sorry for that long diatribe, Mr. Wilkerson, but this is the thing that is
well. One comment on it before we close out of that is that I just want to say, one of the things that kept the facade up for so long, and why the Republicans and others didn't stand up for it, was because American corporations saw the Chinese market and they said, we want that. There was greed. It was simply greed that Absolutely. Maybe it wasn't in their true interest, but they believed it was. They believed that, no, we have to stay silent on these issues because we got to get into China. It's the largest market in the world. Whether you were Disney, Nike, any of these corporations, boards and board of directors, management teams were scared to death, and still are, of offending China and losing the Chinese market. And this is a tension that we're going to have to figure out how to resolve, because there are incompatible loyalties at this moment between what is in the interest of this nation and the people of this nation and the profits interests. And I'm a free market guy. I'm a business guy. I like to make money. I think it's one of the great things of our country is the free market system. But we have this tension here with regard to China that is going to have to be resolved.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. I'm a free market guy myself. But what we have is, during the Cold War, for example, when Ford wanted to build a factory in the Soviet Union, you had the Defense Department stood up vigorously, protested, and the political class listened and ultimately prevented it. And Ford really had a black mark from that point on during that time. In the fast forward to the 90s, it was completely different. The Defense Department was steamrolled by the political class, who said, we're going to do this. And they had a fig leaf of, if once we open up China with aid and trade, then they'll become an ally and they'll throw off the shackles of communism, something that everybody thinking person knew was not true, was not going to happen, and that they were aiming for a powerful military so that they could assert their hegemonic objectives, and that's what they're doing now. But you're right, there has to be some kind of way of dealing with the issue of China, because they are aiming and are on track to achieve some highly successful financial objectives around the world. While they're on track to have 5 aircraft carriers by the year 2030. And aircraft carriers are not a defensive piece of military. They are for offensive purposes. And we're going to take a short time out. We'll come back with Michael Wilkerson, author of Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. We've been talking about all the cynical side of this. When we get back, we'll talk about the upside, the optimism that Mr. Wilkerson has. We'll ask him what it will take to shake us out of this, and how it works, and how America can recover from its current situation. This is Through the Looking Glass on TNT Radio. I'm Scott Wheeler. We'll be right back.
Give me a minute with TNT Radio's Steve Malzberg.
I will confess I don't know much about the police in the UK. I grew up in New York, and I'm a former NYPD PBA Man of the Year, probably the greatest honor I've ever received. But I've always been under the impression that cops are underpaid, and there never seems to be enough money to remedy that, or to provide police departments and the officers with all that's needed to be as safe and effective as possible. So imagine my surprise when I saw this headline on FoxNews.com. UK police forces spent thousands on rainbow cars and flags supporting LGBT community. So who knew that in the UK, police across the country were so well funded that they could afford to spend $80,000 on this merchandise between 2019 and 2022. Reportedly, the South Wales police force was the biggest spender, forking over roughly $29,000 for rainbow-themed shirts and badges, pens, whistles, flags, water bottles, you name it. What's next? Well, maybe the police won't help you unless you worship the rainbow and prove it. Sounds crazy, huh? So is this whole story. Thanks for giving me a minute. I'm Steve Malzberg for TNT Radio.
If you've taken meth, don't drive for at least 24 hours. If you've taken meth, don't drive for at least 24 hours. If you've taken meth, don't drive for at least 24 hours. If you've taken meth, don't drive for at least 24 hours. Even the smallest amount detected will cost your license. Drug drive and you'll get caught, long after the high is gone. Think road safety, a message from the Government of South Australia.
At the top of the hour, we'll keep on top of the news.
It's the most important thing we can do.
On today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler in Washington, D.C. on TNT Radio. You can hear all of our previous episodes if you go to the TNT Radio website, and you can hear all of the previous episodes of all the broadcasters on the network. Right now, we're speaking to Michael Wilkerson, author of Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism, a very well-timed book, Mr. Wilkerson, as almost everyone has noticed the crisis that our nation is in. And let me ask you, going into the break, we were talking about, but before we move on to the optimistic side of this, the recovery that you see can happen, is there anything else on the cynical side that you'd like to cover that we may have missed? I kind of got off on a diatribe and didn't give you a chance
Yeah, Scott, there's so much. I know we have a limited amount of time. Your audience can check out the book, Why America Matters. They can find it at whyamericamatters.com. I talk about the foreign adversaries that we've been talking about, the challenges from abroad. I also talk about the ideological attack that we've been under for a generation now, for 50 years. And I talk about the crisis of identity, that Americans no longer know who they are. They're very confused about, especially younger age cohorts, about whether the ideas of American democracy, for example, matter. And we've got a lot of circumstances barreling down at us: inflation, conflict elsewhere. We were talking before about China and about how America had sold itself short, way short, in IP transfer and other things. One of the things, this isn't optimism, but this is the transition that makes may bridge it together, is I think one of the unintended consequences of pandemic lockdowns, all of the things that went on in the last couple of years, was it was a further eye opener for America and for governments all over the world to realize, hold on, perhaps having our strategic resources, our supply chains in the hands of potential adversaries isn't such a good idea. It sounds obvious, but that's where we had ended up. And we saw it during lockdowns and with travel restrictions, everything else. We couldn't get medicines, we couldn't get supplies. China controls all of those things. Germany obviously realizing they made a terrible strategic error in entrusting their energy supply to their historical adversary, Russia. But that's what they did because they were following a woke ideology and a green utopia that we're not ready for. But the point I'm making here by saying this is that we Americans, their eyes are waking up, are opening to see what is going on, realizing the conflict around us. And I think being aware is the first step to recovery. Knowing that you have a problem, admitting you have a problem, is the first step. I also argue in Why America Matters that we are in this era of discovery. We've somehow been living with these lies. You and others were talking about them, pointing them out for a long time. But by and large, Americans have been ignorant about, unaware, willfully unaware in many cases, of what was actually going on. In this environment, the magnitude of discovery of the corruption that's going on in our government is so front and center that it's impossible to avoid. I've argued recently that I think things like the Twitter files are only the first dominoes to fall, and that they are triggering, even as we speak, a large domino movement, a snowball. Maybe that's a better metaphor. It's a snowball that starts small, but it builds as it rolls down the hill until you have something very serious.
Let me stop you right there first,
yep.
If I can. I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me, because you point this out. We see this massive corruption and the corruption of so many institutions. But the way the press corps and the way half the country see it is political disputes, not what it is. I mean, even myself, I constantly have to remind people, I think the Republicans are the stupid party. I'm not pointing out the corruption in the Democrat Party because I'm a Republican. I'm pointing it out because it has to be acknowledged. But so few people, the Democrats have done such a great job of teaching its people, its followers and supporters, to hate on command, hate Trump or hate whoever, hate Ted Cruz, hate Kevin McCarthy, whoever is the target at that moment, hate them for all these reasons. And their people, when you see on Twitter or Facebook, social media, you see those attacks by just dumb attacks, not even logical, thought out attacks of, going after the vulnerabilities of a particular target of the Democrat Party, like Elon Musk or somebody like that, but just a broadside attack. And, you say we're seeing it and it's starting to unravel with Twitter, but it's only unraveling for people who are already aware of that there's something big wrong with our government and our country. And it's not being recognized by the other half. What do you say to that? Am I wrong on that?
Well, I think you're right. I think there are, let's say, the vocal minority on both sides who have been paying attention, who care. But there is, Scott, I believe, this massive middle of Americans who unfortunately just couldn't be bothered with a lot of this. They were busy with their lives and their families and their jobs and everything else. And they are open to the truth. In other words, they're not ideologues. They are people who, if they understand the truth, they accept it as reality. They're not purely.
Do they know where to
driven.
Find it though? Now that they know something, many of them, I agree with you, but many of them,
but that's a solvable problem. That's and so
now,
part of my point is the snowball
solvable problem. All right,
the snowball analogy here is that eventually, or the avalanche becomes so great that you cannot not see it anymore. I think you're right that it's been hidden, suppressed. I mean, think about how much suppression has been going on around the Hunter Biden laptop, around Russian interference, all this other stuff. In fact, by the way, to your point, like 3 weeks ago, middle of December, we were well into the Twitter files. There was a poll done, like something like 54% of Americans had not heard of the Twitter files, which I think is the point you're making, right? Is if you're not hearing that something exists, if it gets memory holed by the mainstream media. The ray of sunshine here that I'll put into this conversation is that there's just so much, and it's all coming out. And the fact that you now have the House of Representatives controlled by a group of people who are now committed to the equivalent of a new church committee, I think is very important, because this stuff has to come out in the light of day. This unselect January 6th committee tried to do it, but it was purely narrative, and Americans saw through it, and they didn't believe it, and they didn't care. And it ultimately failed. I think it will be different when it is.
Your optimism over the slight Republican majority in the House it's a reason to be a little bit optimistic. But having seen this movie before over and over and over again over the years, Republicans are already not taking the right approach. They don't even know how to message what they're doing effectively. Instead of saying they're taking this anti-intelligence community standpoint without explaining they're not against national security. They're against the politicization of it by the Democrat Party, which is what has happened. And they can't even get their messaging right to appeal to their own voters, let alone to the other side, which is really important at this point to get to where you think we can get to. And I hope I'm wrong. maybe you can point to something that will clarify it for me. But it just doesn't seem like they have the wherewithal to get their job done.
Listen, I think it's a fair point. One of the things that I argue that we have to get back to, and we talked about this right at the beginning, is that each branch of government needs to start doing its job again. Legislature needs to start legislating. The judiciary needs to stop hiding from taking on challenges and issues and faith and rule, but they shouldn't be asked to be making laws. The reason why you see this flurry of executive orders from the Biden administration was, of course, because Congress has abdicated its ability to actually get legislation done. So a whole bunch of issues there. But an example, one of the main points, he said, what does it take to make it better? Is absolutely Americans, which historically were very involved in civic life, have in our generation retreated behind their screens, retreated to their couches, given it over to somebody else to do it. I do see signs that is changing, and that is an important part. What is the case in point? The parents of Loudoun County, who, by dint of lockdowns, for the first time saw the curriculum of their children, what was being taught in their schools. And you had a bunch of angry mama bears and papa bears saying, this shall not pass. We will not allow this. And in the face of intimidation by the FBI and the DOJ, the security apparatus of this country, did not back down, pushed forward. What happened? They ousted the board of supervisors for Loudoun County schools, and they elected a new governor of the state of Virginia who ran on a platform that said parents first. Parents have the right to determine the education of their children. That is an archetype of what has to happen in this nation. Why is that? Because Americans need to think that political change doesn't come once every 4 years based on who's in the Oval Office. Not at all. It has to start locally. It has to start in school boards, town councils, other civic organizations, volunteer organizations. Everyone has something that they can do. But it also means that we need to start paying more attention to the people that we send to Congress, because that is where much of the incompetence that you describe and the corruption that you describe, which I think, by the way, are probably pretty evenly distributed across the parties, and replace them with people who are actually representatives who are actually going to carry out the will of the people who put them there to begin with.
Well, you make a very good point, the Loudoun County point, which is right down the street from Washington, D.C. But when you look at how it's still being fought very bitterly, you would think something so obvious would have had such an overwhelming reaction from the people in Loudoun County, because it's making national news. And so they were forced to look at it and say, what's going on here? But it's still, in my estimation, it didn't seem to have the kind of overwhelming reaction from the citizens of Loudoun County, that would have been warranted under the circumstances. A threat to their children are being taught things and being lied to, and the administration can't be trusted to protect their children and inform the parents. And and some of them had a very strong reaction, but most of them were kind of like, yeah, that's not good, and then kind of let it go. And so rather than try to trace it back to its roots, why are we doing this? They're just kind of very passé about it. It seemed to me, watching it up close. There should have been a storm in Loudoun County down at the school board meetings. There should have been enough money raised to have every school board member replaced. And, there should have been do you see what I mean? I mean, I'm not sure exactly how to express that, but do you see what I mean? That there was a lack of reaction. In the fact there was a reaction, there was a lack of an appropriate response, I would say, from the parents. Did you notice that, or do you disagree?
Well, listen, I don't disagree. I don't have enough facts specifically of how others reacted in the county. I speak to the objectives of what they were able to accomplish, including at the state level with the governor, as I mentioned. What I will say is that you're hitting on a big issue, which is apathy, right? Which is that, as we've talked about before, some people just can't be bothered. That's a terrible thing, and I think that's partly why you do what you do, and what I'm trying to do, what I'm doing, which is to encourage people to get off their couches, to say that if more of us don't start doing more things in resistance to what is happening, we will lose this nation. We will lose the freedoms that we depend on. And by the way, just like your journalist friend in Hong Kong, the people all over the world look to us to provide in a defense against this ever-present totalitarian spirit that wants aggressively to undermine the values of this country and ultimately to undermine our economy, or at least to take its wealth for themselves. So I think you're hitting on a very important issue, which is the apathy that still exists in this nation. The people don't see the problem, don't care about the problem, want someone else to solve it, or don't believe it's true. And that's why we have to keep fighting and keep getting the message out there. Because if we let it go, it will go the other way if we don't fight for it.
We're speaking with Michael Wilkerson, author of the book, Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. And it's an excellent book. What I've read of it is outstanding. It identifies the real problems and offers some possibilities for a solution. And in the book, you refer to a new thing, like a new invention or something that could jar the country back into unity. And didn't we really have that with the internet back in the proliferation of the internet in the late 90s? We had that thing. People could communicate. You had more access to information, and it worked for a little while. And then suddenly there was kind of this drop off, and everybody went back to their corners, and nobody's listening to arguments from people who disagree with them.
Right. Well, we talked about before that didn't just happen by accident. In other words, that democratization, that process was threatening to the surveillance state and threatening to the powers that be. And so they infiltrated it and they took it over. And so you're right. That had potential to be something like an equalizing and democratizing force that was strongly resisted for that very reason. We see the same thing in crypto today. I've argued that crypto holds a lot of potential because of its properties of being stateless, trustless, no intermediaries, you don't have to rely on a government, etc. But it is exactly for that reason why it's such a threat to governments and why they will do everything they can to resist it. Now, I think, and I use the word new exceptionalism because I don't think we can just go back to our past. Either the isolationism of the 19th century or the hyper interventionalism of the late 20th century. We have to have a new model for a new era. And that also, that was in reference to foreign affairs. I'm talking more even domestically, that we have to, pardon the expression, but rally around the flag of American ideals. But they need to be spoken to in a way that translates to the 21st century, including now, unfortunately, to an entire generation of younger people who didn't hear it in school, who didn't get lessons in American history or civics, or at least not the true lessons that form the backbone of the ideals that made and principles that made this country great. Unfortunately, many of them were fed an ideological poison that undermines their faith and confidence in this nation and its meaning. And it could take some time to work ourselves out of that. But I do argue that we have to get back to, in our public schools and elsewhere, a basic education in civics, in American history. Let the truth be told, not this, the fake stuff. If we don't have that, we will lose a generation, and we're already losing one right now. But that is one area where we have to turn the tide.
That is a very, very smart point. And I want to thank you, Mr. Wilkerson, for taking the time. I recommend that everyone read this book, Why America Matters, The Case for a New Exceptionalism. If nothing else, it will prepare you for what may or may not happen, but at least you'll have some understanding of the problems that are being confronted right now, we're confronting, and what could happen. Thank you again, Mr. Wilkerson. Well, Mr. Wilkerson, thank you for taking the time and joining us on Through the Looking Glass.
Thank you, Scott. TNT. Just to remind that they can find the book at whyamericamatters.com and find all my writings at stormwall.com.
Stormwall.com. For TNT Radio and Through the Looking Glass, I'm Scott Wheeler.